I really feel quite honoured because I'm not a speech and language therapist, but I work very closely, obviously, with members of the profession. So I feel it's great to have a chance to give this lecture, which is obviously the big one for your profession. I have got some references relating to this presentation. It is being filmed, so you'll be able to catch up on it. But if you want to check out references behind what I'm talking about, SlideShare is the place to go. And in fact, if you just Google my name and SlideShare, you get to this particular place where you'll find the references that are relevant. But let me start with where I sort of first got into realizing that we badly needed to talk about terminology and to make decisions about terminology. And it's my sort of famous taxi quote, which is that I was sitting in a taxi and I had this sudden realization that every time I traveled in a taxi with a talkative taxi driver who would say, "What do you do then?" I would try and explain what I did and meet with incomprehension. So long as I said I work on specific language impairment. Every taxi driver I spoke to had never heard of specific language impairment. So I gradually learned over the years that what you do is you say, "Oh, I work on children who have problems," sort of things like autism and dyslexia, and they say, "Oh, yes, yes, very interesting. I know somebody with autism, I know somebody with dyslexia." And I sort of suddenly thought, you know, why is it that specific language impairment, nobody's heard of it, everybody's heard of autism and dyslexia? And I thought, we have a problem. We have an image problem. We're a sort of Cinderella subject, and this is the subject I've worked on since the 1970s in my career, and I thought that things are not really getting any better or easier. I then thought it would be quite interesting to check out this intuition I had that we had a big problem by then just looking at the literature. Is it the case that it is a Cinderella subject relative to other neurodevelopmental disorders that are similar in terms of frequency and severity? Because you could say, well, everybody's heard of autism because it's a more serious condition in the sense that many people with autism are not able to live independent lives, whereas that's not so true for specific language impairment. But what I did was to look at a whole load of neurodevelopmental disorders in this paper in 2010, and this graph is just showing you the amount of money spent in dollars on research on in blue, ADHD, in pink, autism spectrum disorder, and in purple, dyslexia and SLI and speech disorder and dyscalculia and developmental coordination disorder, creeping along the bottom here. And if you actually break that down, the dyslexia category is the biggest one, but it's not that different from SLI. Speech disorder, dyscalculia, and DCD, I have to say, are even more Cinderella subjects. But this was, to me, vindication of the idea that this is a problem, because when we asked people to rate how severe a disorder was, and when we also tried to get estimates of prevalence of the disorders, how common they were, ADHD and SLI were very similar. And yet ADHD had 15 to 20 times as much research going on and 15 to 20 times as much money expended on it, and is visible to most people. So this to me made me even more determined that we needed to do something about this because it really was a problem. One of the reasons I decided that we had a problem was to do with terminology. I mean, I sort of thought for a number of reasons why this issue might be there, and I speculated in the paper about them. But it was evident to me that we had a difficulty with terminology because it was just really difficult to do the count of how much research there was because everybody used different terminology anyway. I had to search through innumerable different labels to try and get together an idea of how much research there was on SLI, because some people called it SLI. We also had the problem that SLI is the name for some sort of worm, and it's a name for all sorts of peculiar other things. So if you try and just do a search for SLI, you get into trouble. You find you're picking up the wrong things. But if you looked for example, primary language learning impairment, you'd probably find it. Some people would use primary, some people would use specific, some would use developmental, some would not have a prefix, and then some people talked about language, speech and language, etc., etc. You can see on this slide there were people talking about needs, difficulties, problems, impairments, disabilities, disorders, delay, and you can actually put those terms together in terms of in 168 different possible ways, and I found 130 of them in the literature. And a lot of them were not used very often, but there were 33 terms that were used a lot, 600 times or more during that period. So you can see that we're not really agreeing how we're talking about a fairly common developmental difficulty. And it did seem that this is a factor that we need to get straight, because it just is going to impair communication and recognition. So the next thing that happened was I got together with some of my mates and had a glass of something nice, and we got together and decided we were sufficiently concerned about this that we were going to try and raise awareness of what we didn't know what to call it. This was the problem. We thought, what are we raising awareness of these 130 different possibilities? At the time we decided we'd pick language learning impairments as a sort of relatively different but novel term, which also gave us an acronym, RALLY. And the people that we got together were myself with colleagues Maggie Snowling, Gina Conti-Ramsden, Courtney Norbury, Becky Clark, and then two people from public relations, Natalie and Beth from this organisation Team Spirit. Natalie Orange is a quite senior person in the field of public relations who is a friend of Becky's, as it happened, and who persuaded us that what we really needed if we were going to raise awareness was not a load more scientific research, it was public relations. It was like an advertising campaign. It was putting stuff out there so that people could find it. This was invaluable advice. I have to tell you, when we first met together and discussed what we had in mind, what I had in mind was making a sort of lecture to go on YouTube or somewhere on the internet on specific language impairment, explaining what it was and so on. And that this might last about 20 minutes. And Natalie looked horrified. And she said, nobody watches anything that's longer than 3 minutes. And I was horrified. I said, you can't say anything in 3 minutes. You know, so we had this sort of interesting exchange. And what we ended up realizing we could do was to make very short videos that fitted with this short attention span of the world at large, but complement them with the sort of thing that as an academic I thought was essential, which was the hard evidence, the references. So for a lot of the films that we do, we have, in addition to a short film, we do have slides, and in some cases we actually have journal references. It depends on which sort of film we're making and the target audience. But it seemed to me important that you could back what you set up with evidence, but you don't have to shove it down people's throats in the way that you would in an academic talk. So we started this campaign, and we made quite a lot of nice little videos with, and I should say Becky Clark, who's here, our video editor, has been amazing in terms of making this happen. So we also were sternly told at the start by Natalie and others that we had to be clear what our goals were. I go into things without being very clear about my goals, which is you've got to have goals. So we worked out that our goals were to raise awareness of language impairments through YouTube, but also to sort out this mess in definitions and terminology. And after we'd been going for a couple of years, we realized that we'd tackled the first, but that we hadn't tackled the second. Sorting out the mess was actually going to be quite a problem, because we kept finding that whenever we tried to make a video, we had to define what we were talking about. Who were we talking about? And in fact, we talked a lot about specific language impairment, but then we got people writing in saying, why are you using the term specific language impairment? We don't like it, it's problematic, because there was a sort of sense out there that many people were beginning to be unhappy with it. Before I go on to the next slide, I should also say these the people below made this all possible. We were helped massively by APHASIC, both the Welsh branch and the London branch, the Waterloo Foundation, and that they both came up with some funding to help get us going. And we were very fortunate that the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Wellcome Trust also encouraged us to use some funding that we had from grants for this sort of public engagement side of things. And without this, this wouldn't have been possible. But the sums were all quite small. We got a lot of pro bono help from Team Spirit and also people just being willing to put time in. So there we were with our campaign to raise awareness of something that none of us could quite agree what it was. But we then thought we've got to do something about this mess. So what happened next? Well, what was very interesting was that there was a lot of serendipity here. There was a lot of really fortunate things that just happened to co-occur around the same time that got us going in the right direction, I think. One was that at this winter lecture, back in 2013, Sheena Riley came over from Australia to deliver the winter lecture. Sheena Riley was one of the people who'd started making noises not liking the term specific language impairment. She's an influential person. She'd been involved in a big study in Melbourne, an epidemiological study looking at young children with language problems. And she was saying, essentially in her winter lecture, you know, how useful is this term specific language impairment? It doesn't fit a lot of the children that we're seeing. Their problems are not so specific. Are we really using a term that's no longer worth having? So she was quite definite about this. Now, funnily enough, if you'd give a winter lecture, as I discovered, feeling, oh no, you have to write it up. So you have to have something to give the journal. And so Sheena was going to write this up. And I didn't know this, but around the same time, I just contacted the editors of the journal saying, we in Raleigh have been very concerned about terminology. We think it's something that needs some discussion. It needs people getting together. And we thought that the journal would be the perfect place to do this because it's obviously the academic outlet for the speech-language therapy profession. So I actually got in touch and just suggested that maybe we could have some forum for debate in the context of the journal. And Sheena was going to do her lecture, and so it was suggested to me, and I think it was Nikki Botting I was talking to at the time, that we should maybe have a special issue of the journal where different people could put forward different points of view. And in the end, what we did was Susan kindly agreed to edit it, and we had this special issue in 2014 with a paper by Sheena, a paper by me, and then a lot of commentaries by people invited by Susan who very carefully selected people to try and represent a wide range of different viewpoints. Clinicians, academics, speech and language therapists, but also psychologists, also representatives of parent support organisations, and educational people, medics. It was quite a wide range of people able to say what they thought about these terminological issues. And this was a really helpful beginning to have all this sort of out there so that one could reflect on it and try and identify why we had all this disagreement. We also had things happening on the internet, and as you gather, Christina's an internet person, I'm an internet person, we're all into Twitter, and this is great because it really did allow for additional debate from people who might otherwise not get their voices heard. So the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists had this internet forum that they set up that people could write in and suggest what they thought about these things. And then again, coming from Australia, there is this group, We Speechies, who have these occasional sort of Twitter debates where you set aside a particular time and some questions that we're going to deal with, and people can then just, it's obviously Twitter you can't say very much, it's just 140 characters, but you can ask questions and get answers and identify people who have views who are of interest. And I hosted one of those around the time that the special issue came out, and we had quite a lot of lively interaction there. So we felt we were getting a critical mass of views and thoughts from people as to what we should do about terminology. But perhaps the really serendipitous thing was my meeting with this fine lady, Trish Greenhall, who's now Professor of Primary Healthcare Sciences in Oxford. But at the time, I only knew her through Twitter. But I thought she was a good egg. She was a very interesting woman to interact with on Twitter, who had views that were often very like mine. And in a moment of madness, I invited her to a feast in Oxford. The sort of thing that only happens in Oxford. But you get these feasts happening every now and again because somebody in the 15th century had a lot of money and left it for the fellows of St. John's College to have feasts. And, you know, you just have to have a feast. And you are encouraged to bring a guest. And she was wondering, Trish kept saying, I feel bad about this. Who's paying for this? And I said, it's this guy in the 15th century. Don't worry, come and feed. So she was quite keen because she was at the time in London, but was actually moving to Oxford, unbeknownst to me. So we met and we got on like a house on fire. And over the sort of drinks after dinner, we discussed sort of the sort of work we do. And she's very much, she's a GP by background, but she's interested in qualitative research, which is something I have very little experience of. But so I told her she said, what do you work on? I said, I work on this condition, nobody can agree what it's called. And she said, I know about conditions like that. What you need is a Delphi exercise. And I had never heard of a Delphi exercise. But she explained to me what's involved. And for those of you who haven't heard of it, I'll tell you a bit about how it works. But essentially, it's an attempt to try and get consensus between people on things like terminological issues. And she sold it to me as the perfect solution to the problem that we had of having lots of different points of view, but wanting to somehow bring people together to agree. And she agreed to help us as well, because she had some experience of going through this process. So we did do this Delphi. In fact, we did 2 separate cycles of this. One trying to agree on criteria, which we completed in November 2015, and one on terminology, which we completed last September. And these yielded really rich, complicated, detailed sets of data, and they're quite long, but I think very interesting, and I can't easily summarize them in a short talk, but they are all available open access. So the first criterion one was actually published in PLOS One, and the second one is currently under consideration for publication, but is meanwhile available as a Peer-J preprint, and the references to these are in that slide share thing if you want to get hold of them, or we can probably put them out somewhere else if necessary. So all I'm going to do is tell you a bit about how this process worked, a little bit about the conclusions, but I'm also going to take the opportunity to reflect on the more qualitative stuff we got out and about what it tells us about why we have these disagreements, because I think you have to understand why these things are so difficult in order to reach solutions rather than just saying, oh, we found a solution. So, first of all, what was our focus? That was one of the first really sticking points, was who was it that we were thinking we were trying to label if we were trying to get a decent label that we agree on? And at the time we were doing this work, I was aware that there was already quite a lot of debate in the profession about, how far speech and language therapists should be just focusing on seeing children one-on-one with more severe problems, or working in a more consultative capacity in schools, affecting, sort of perhaps what's done universally in schools to try and improve language, or in terms of children having more targeted provision. But we decided that we were mostly interested in what the terminology would be for children who were not going to respond or hadn't responded adequately to high quality sort of classroom manipulations, but really did need, if you like, specialist help from a speech and language therapist, or at least specialist assessment and advice. So we're really talking about that tip of the iceberg. We're not talking about children who are just a bit sort of, not got very good vocabulary or something like that. We're talking about children where there seem to be more serious problems. But everybody agreed that these children do exist. So the question was, can we find what sort of terminology should we use for those? And the bottom line, and I've learnt over a long career of giving talks, that you tell people your conclusion reasonably early in the talk, because some of them will fall asleep. So the bottom line is that we did decide, or it was agreed, that the term that we should be using is not specific language impairment, which had a number of objections to it that were raised, but was developmental language disorder. And we also even got a hashtag, thanks to Caroline Bowen from Australia, who's very big on hashtags. So this is the bottom line, that this is what we ended up with. And so what I'll try and do in the rest of the talk is just explain a bit about how we got there and why we got there. And really how what we've agreed on is different from what's currently going on. I'll just say a bit, first of all, about the expert panel. It was international, although it was predominantly people from the UK. So I don't know if you can see right down the bottom here, we've got 30 people from the UK out of a panel of 59. But we've also got representatives of Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, and the United States. It's also predominantly speech and language therapists. So 32 of the panel, again, were speech and language therapists or speech pathologists in the States. But we also did have representation from other specialties. And when we've written this up, you know, we sometimes get criticism from people who say, well, you should have had more people from education, you should have had more even representation. But we felt this was appropriate for what we were trying to do, because we felt we're focusing on a clinical group who are really, you know, the speech and language therapy profession is the profession that really deals with these children. This is their population, if you like. So they should have the biggest say, but we wanted input from other professions because we didn't want to go off into some sort of completely, you know, ignoring what other professions thought. And similarly, we felt that we should focus on the UK because we didn't really want the UK to develop some sort of terminological change that nobody else agreed with. But on the other hand, we couldn't realistically involve a lot more people. I mean, this was a large panel. 59 people for a Delphi is a very large panel. I hadn't realized this until Trish, I said to her, should we try and get up to 100? And she said, no, 30 people is what you need. And I said, oh, we've already got 59. And she, oh, but we managed somehow to cope with 59. We had this, myself and Maggie Snowling acted as moderators because we basically ran this project on a shoestring on existing funding from Oxford, where we both had some Wellcome Trust funding that we were able to deploy in this direction. And fortunately, this allowed us to include Paul Thompson, who's a biostatistician who's worked with both of us and currently in my group, who was able to get involved on the sort of data analytics side. So this is the group of people involved. And what did we do? Well, the way a Delphi actually works is that you need to start with some statements. And we, first of all, just tried to get loads and loads of statements that we basically took from the special issue, from the Twitter debate, and from the online forum. And we got a pool of far too many statements, but we boiled them down to a set of about 47, I think it was, which were then online sent out, just like a sort of questionnaire. You had to rate them on a scale of how far you agreed with them, but you also had the opportunity to give verbal qualitative comments. In fact, initially we got everybody to rank them for two things, relevance and validity, but it was really just whether you agreed with it or not that turned out to be the key thing. Now, the beauty of the Delphi is that it's online, so people can take their time and think about things and respond. And we were very impressed at how thoughtful a lot of panel members were, and they did put time in. But the other beauty of it is that they then get feedback. So you get to see what everybody else has rated, except that it's anonymous. And this is very useful because it means that people say what they really think rather than one important person dominating the discussion. So you also then can see what other people have said, so that when it comes round, again, you get the chance to either defend your position or to argue, or to change your mind maybe, or to add extra evidence. So we as the moderators didn't actually do any of the ratings, but we tried to look at what people had done. You could identify which things everybody agreed with, which things were much more contentious. But if things were contentious, you could really get a sense of why were they contentious, what sort of arguments were people using. And you could often revise things so that you got then better agreement if you changed the item somewhat or gave some better justification. So you then do this whole thing again with a new set of statements, and you can keep going forever in theory, but what happens is you typically do converge after a couple of rounds. And what we in the end did was we made a few minor changes after the second round and wrote this up as a manuscript, and all the people on the panel took part in the manuscript and could comment on that. So in effect we had 3 rounds, but the last was not in the conventional format. It was people were no longer anonymous. So what you then get, particularly if you've got somebody like Paul as helping you do this, is these wonderful diagrams. So this looks like the petals on a flower, And each petal corresponds to an item. And as you can see in round one, it was 46 items. And the colour coding is really just telling you how much agreement there was between panel members. And so the redder it is, the more agreement. And anything that's blue is an item where a lot of people disagreed. And what you can see at round one is that we've got quite a lot of red, but we've also got blue here in the middle. But by the time we've got to round two, this is what we were hoping, we get rid of most of the blue. People have stopped disagreeing with the statements because we've either reworded them or dropped them or justified them better. And so we ended up with 27 statements with a pretty good level of agreement. There's always going to be some people that disagree, otherwise it would probably be implausible. But as long as you get about 80% level of agreement, that for a Delphi is reckoned to be not bad at all. But before I tell you a bit more about our sort of conclusions from this whole thing, I wanted to say a bit about what emerged from the more qualitative analysis about why it is so very hard to agree about labels. And it became clear that there's a big problem with labels. A label like developmental language disorder or specific language impairment, if you tell a parent your child has got specific language impairment, they tend to think of this as something like being told your child has got measles, you know, that there is a condition that's a medically recognized condition with a known cause that has caused my child to have language problems. But we know very well from decades of research that it doesn't work like that. So this is, I've put up, there's always a bit of a risk as a speaker. If you put up something that's wrong, that is the one thing people will remember from your talk. But I've put up here, it is wrong. Please note, this is wrong. But this is how a lot of people, including me, I think, starting out in the field, might have hoped things would work out. That you might have a disorder, call it SLI or developmental language disorder, another one called dyslexia, and that if you then start looking at brains, doing neuroscience stuff, or you start looking at, say, genetics or some other causal route, you will find that you have different disorders with different biological bases and different causes. Wouldn't it be nice if that was so? Because if that was so, we could, you know, people talk, there's still a lot of people doing research trying to do brain scanning to develop, you know, to diagnose disorders. To my view, this is very unlikely to succeed because it's not like that. I mean, if you just take within developmental language disorder, you might say, well, maybe the next thing that people did when they found it wasn't like that was to say, well, we've just not got the groupings right. Perhaps there's different subtypes in there, and that if you separate them, you will again find nice little linkages so that there's a sort of different disorder, different brain region, different gene maybe for each of these. It's still wrong. Still, note up here, I'm saying this is not how it works. This is getting closer to the truth, and as you can see, it's very, very messy. So there's loads of genes that might increase the risk for both developmental language disorder and dyslexia, some of them more for one, some more for the other. There's environmental factors in there, there's lots of brain regions, but there's just no simple one-to-one mapping. There's a tremendous amount of really comorbidity between things, in part because there's a lot of risk factors that affect things more than one type of thing. And there's also interactions between genes and environment, so that the actual end result you get can vary hugely. So you can have the same underlying cause with different consequences, or the same consequences with different causes. And it's even worse. So if you start going beyond oral and written language, I mean, we could extend this, only it would go off the screen, but we could include, I should probably move this chair so that you might be able to see that a bit better, but you could include most of the neurodevelopmental disorders, that essentially what we have are interactions such that if you've got a risk for one, it often increases the risk for others. We don't find neat, tidy relationships between these things like components of autism spectrum disorder or ADHD and particular brain regions and particular genes and environments. What we find is we can find risk factors that typically increase the risk for different conditions, but different children can also have, with the same disorder, can have different underlying causes. You can even see this in the context of where we know about a very specific genetic mechanism. I work on children with an additional sex chromosome. The same underlying cause, an additional sex chromosome, in some children is associated with autism, in some children with what looks very like SLI, often with some sort of attentional problems, and in some children with very little impairment at all. And yet you've got the same underlying genetic cause. So we need to really have a much more sophisticated underlying model. This is not a thing that we're talking about down here. It's one aspect of neurodevelopmental disorder that can manifest in many, many different ways. So we have this same causes with different effects, the same disorder with different causes, and then interactions between different genetic risk factors and the environment and between genes themselves. And we're still a long way from unraveling all of this. But insofar as we've made progress on the genetics, it becomes more and more complicated the more work we do on it, rather than simplifying things. Given that that is the case, when we use a label like developmental language disorder, we are not talking about a coherent syndrome, unfortunately, with very neat, tidy edges. There's many overlaps with other neurodevelopmental disorders, and we can very seldom find a single cause. It's very often the case that, for example, in children with language impairment, you may find that there's a family history, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find a single gene. There are a few cases where there is a single mutation in somebody, but it's more likely that what's inherited is a combination of individual genes that each have a very small effect, but the genetic variants can then have different consequences in different combinations. Interestingly enough, this is exactly the problem that's been debated, particularly last year, because this book was published, or 2014 it was published, in the field of dyslexia. It's exactly the same problem that was highlighted by Elliott and Grigorenko in this book, The Dyslexia Debate, where they noted that dyslexia isn't a coherent thing. Everybody outside an academic sphere tends to think of it as a condition, and Julian Elliott's very fond of saying, you know, people come up to me and say, do you think my child has dyslexia? And he says, well, it just, you know, it's not a thing. It's not that you've either got it or you haven't got it. There are children with disproportionate reading problems. They're not denying that. But the notion that you can sort of say there are very specific symptom patterns with a very specific cause is actually a misunderstanding of how it works. But we still need a label. It's all very well saying this isn't a coherent thing. But what would we do if we said, OK, we're not going to have a label? Because there are children who have these problems that might benefit from involvement of a speech-language therapist. And we also need to, if we want to do research, we can't just say everybody's, you know, got different sorts of problems. We need to somehow coherently group children together. And we do need a term for the general public. We need to be able to tell somebody that, you know, their child has got a condition that might help them access services and might require them to have speech and language therapy. So this is where the tension comes, or one reason for the tension is that these are difficult problems to crack. And there's a real tension between the truth, which is this great multivariate mess, where children have all sorts of differences with their language, and the need for a label that carries authority. This was a panel member who was a definite outlier, but makes this point very clearly. We need a label with some authority. I really do have to go back to the suggestion of dysphasia on an analogy with dyslexia and dyspraxia. Terms like this have the advantage of sounding like real conditions, which is why parents fight so hard for a diagnosis of dyslexia. People sit up and take notice of it. And this panel member is absolutely right, that this is why in the field of dyslexia there's huge resistance to abandoning the term, because people feel it gives them some sort of sense that they've actually got something wrong with them. Specific language impairment has never had that kind of authority. On the other hand, if you were Julian Elliott, you'd say, well, it's false authority because it isn't really a thing like that. So you've got that real tension, and this is almost an unresolvable problem, that we need labels to function, but if we use labels, people will interpret them, and there's been the term reification, treating them as if they mean much more than they do. So that's one big problem. There's another problem which is related, which is that the labels that are traditionally used by speech and language therapists are medical sounding. They're not as medical sounding as dysphasia, which was actually very unpopular with our panel, I should say. Nobody wanted to go back to developmental dysphasia except this one person. Everybody else sort of thought it was very misleading and difficult. But there is a resistance to a medical model. And one of the reasons is that people think that it carries if you use these sort of medical labels, people may get stigmatized and there will be low expectations. And this is another panel member who, again, was not representative, but articulated this quite interesting thing, saying he was concerned that the exercise risks generating labels and categories for children that will be operationalized to allocate resources and will discriminate against positive expectations for more than is scientifically justified. So people are getting worried that you're talking about something that is, you're making the child sound as if they've got this thing that makes them very different and not sort of capable of showing improvement. So this is another issue that came up again and again in our discussions. And it became clear that to some extent this is because the different terms that you could use, you realise it's not really arbitrary what sort of term you use, whether you talk about needs or difficulties or problems or delays, impairment, disability or disorder. I've ordered these because I think that they carry very different connotations. The ones at the top sound relatively mild. They tend to sound more as if they might be things that are determined, that could be fixed by changing the environment. They're more descriptive rather than etiological, and they tend to be the terms used in education. Whereas the terms at the bottom move towards sounding more serious, more biological, might have a distinct etiology and more medical. And so depending where you're coming from, you get people who are really strongly in favour or against these different terms. So here's a panel member who said that they said the use of the word disorder has very negative connotations for teachers and for those within educational policy. But there's no useful term that gets around this issue. And this was the problem we had, that you had people who were very reluctant to use a term like disorder because of the negative connotations. But there were also other people who thought if you didn't use such a term, it would trivialize the child's problems. This comes on to the third point, which is also related, which is the label you use does affect who gets access to services. And there were panel members who had completely opposite views on this. So there were some who said things like, in many areas of the UK, children who have a poor prognosis are not getting services because they clog up the system and can't be discharged easily. And that was thought to be a bad thing. But then there were panel members who were concerned that children with more specific language issues were missing out. Those who had, this person said that I regularly encounter situations where services are denied to families because their children only presented with language impairments, and the risk of undertreatment in these cases is what our epidemiological data have been telling us. So this is somebody who thinks that all the resources are going to children who've got lots of different things wrong with them, and the poor child who's just got a specific language problem is losing out. Exactly opposite views as to what should be happening represented within the panel. I mean, when you look at this, it's amazing we ever achieved agreement on anything. What was the consensus? I'm going to have to go through this fairly quickly, obviously, because it's a huge amount of stuff. But CATALISE 1, when we were talking about criteria for identification of children, this is a summary slide that we used to try and summarise, several pages of text that we generated. But we felt that it sort of sounds very obvious that if you're concerned about it, somebody's concerned about a child's speech, language, or communication, they should be referred for evaluation. But what was much more controversial was that there was a view that you should also refer children who are presenting with behavioural or psychiatric difficulties. And this was because there's very good evidence of extremely high rates of language and communication problems in those children. But a lot of people blenched at this and thought, my goodness, it's going to flood the services. But we felt, at the end of the day, there were a lot of people on the panel who said, if these are the children who've got language problems, we shouldn't ignore them. So there's a view that many children who are presenting, not necessarily looking as if they've got a language problem, have got an underlying language problem, and it will present as a behavioural or psychiatric problem. The exception here is if you've got a very young child under 2 years of age who's a late talker, it was felt it was not appropriate to refer them because so many of children of that age, sort of who are not speaking at 18 months, are speaking later on without needing intervention. What you then do is to assess them, and the assessment process should involve multiple sources. It should involve caregiver report, observation, standardized tests, language learning context observation of. So and again, people were sort of saying, oh, we're never going to be able to do all of that. But again, I think people kept coming back and saying, we can't just say we're not going to argue for this if we feel that this is the way to do things. Rather, we should argue this is an ideal to strive for, and we should argue for the resources for it. It's important to consider content, form, and use of language, receptive and as well as expressive, and there you do need formal assessments of receptive language because it's extremely hard to judge just on the basis of observation. We should be concerned not just with grammar and vocabulary, but also with pragmatics and phonology. They should all be seen as coming under the domain of speech and language and communication. And verbal learning and memory, not just a focus on static performance, but on how the child learns language. And this, of course, brings us to aspects of dynamic assessment, where, again, it was recognized that it's an ideal that we had a long way from being able to achieve with current assessments. Then it was argued we should also be identifying additional factors, co-occurring problems. So I've already mentioned that you often get co-occurring problems with motor skills, attention, reading, interaction, non-verbal skills and behavior. And then there, of course, you may have associated known conditions such as genetic syndromes, autism, acquired brain injury and hearing loss. So the idea is that you would, all these things should be at least identified. If you then say, well, what do you then do with this information to get at terminology, it's basically quite a simple model, although the devil is in the detail. You start with a child who has a receptive or expressive language problem that affects everyday functioning. So there was, again, an emphasis on function, not just a low test score. Somebody should be showing that this is affecting how the child communicates with others, their educational progress. Then you simply go, I say simply, it's not simple at all, but you go through the loop of just saying, could this simply be that they haven't had enough exposure to English in this case? If they're learning another language at home, speaking another language at home. And the key thing that everybody works with multilingual populations argues is that the key thing is the child actually competent in another language? That, of course, can be extremely difficult to assess. But we're moving towards recognizing the need to have perhaps parental report assessments at least that might be translatable more easily than having to norm a load of tests. But if you then say, no, we've ruled that out, so the child either is not multilingual or doesn't have adequate competence in any language, the key thing we argued you should use is whether there is a poor prognosis. And of course the question is, do we know enough to really be able to judge that? And we argued that we've got enough longitudinal studies to know that if a child has got a significant comprehension problem, after the age of about 2, they're likely to really go on to have longer term problems. And if at an older age they've got problems across the board affecting all aspects of language, they're likely to have a poor prognosis. If they don't have those features, you stop there, and they may very well be children who would benefit from some help in school, but they don't necessarily they wouldn't be in that tier 3. You then ask about associated biomedical conditions, and here we're talking about those conditions I mentioned before, so autism spectrum disorder, brain injury, sensory neural hearing loss, a syndrome such as Down syndrome. And if that's the case, then you would make a diagnosis of a language disorder associated with that condition, but otherwise you get to developmental language disorder. So that's the route through this sort of diagnostic pathway that we mapped. Now, as I say, sometimes you're not quite sure how to make those decisions, but we felt where necessary, we should be looking for more research to make it easier to, for example, be clear about what factors are associated with poor prognosis. The thing here, though, is that may look to you as if it's not that different from what's gone before, but it's actually radically quite different in several ways. The definition is a very broad definition. It includes all sorts of aspects of language. And we did consider having within this trying to identify subtypes. But there was no agreement about subtypes. And I think that what there was agreement on is that you can specify them, but then you get loads of children that don't actually meet them. So it was felt that what we needed was a diagnosis of developmental language disorder and then specifiers saying which aspects of language were most affected. Risk factors should then be noted but were not exclusionary. So having a family history, growing up in poverty, having a low level of parental education, etc., indeed being male, are all risk factors for language impairment, but that is all they are. They're not explanations for language impairment that should be used to somehow categorize children in a different pathway. And co-occurring disorders, likewise, should be noted but not used as exclusionary factors. So the general view was that for too long there'd been an attempt, this is the dislike of specific language impairment, and the idea that somehow everything has to be incredibly specific and only language affected, which, if taken to its literal extreme, it means you only end up with a very tiny group of children. It was felt that was inappropriate. So what's new is that developmental language disorder is replacing SLI in terminology, but it's defined in terms of functional impairment and poor prognosis. What we don't use is any notion of a difference between delay and disorder, because there's just no empirical support for it. And a lot of the practitioners on our panel were quite amazed by this, because they've been taught to do this, to try and make that distinction. And we kept saying, if you look at the research literature, people have tried to look at that and it just doesn't work. It's not valid. Using social background as a criterion for identifying disorder, we were very clear this should not happen, because again, there was no validity to it. Non-verbal IQ should not be a criterion. Once again, there's no evidence that children who have a big mismatch between non-verbal IQ and language have any different prognosis. In fact, if anything, they are the ones with the poor prognosis, but they're no less likely to respond to intervention, and their needs are just as great. And in fact, it can be an equity issue if you start excluding them. And the additional disorders are a descriptor rather than an exclusionary factor. So the key issue we felt that came out through this is that it's all down to access to services, really, because the label you get determines who gets services. And this is going to raise problems. We're aware of this for services, because it is going to change who we're going to argue should get access. But we felt really that the rational response was for the profession to start saying, what have you got to offer by way of effective intervention? The evidence base, unfortunately, is still very weak. And a lot of what people do is based on habitual practice, or just assuming that if you do something, it's going to work, or you're under pressure from your local authority or whoever to do something specific. But what's needed is better evidence and more multi-center intervention research with big enough groups that we can be more confident. Because the thing is, you can get funding for services if you can demonstrate they're effective. That's the key thing. So without that evidence base, it's really difficult. But the other thing that came across really is that it's not that if you have intervention that works, what you're doing is curing the child. A lot of the children we're talking about, we know they have poor prognosis. Some of them have poor prognosis despite being in really wonderful special schools for many years. Then they're still not coming out of those absolutely normal language. But it makes a big difference to them how they're managed. It can be a big impact on the child and the family, just knowing that they have this condition and learning that it's not their fault. You can reduce mental health problems. You can teach children strategies to deal with things. But we haven't got ways of measuring those outcomes very well. Those are the outcomes that we need to be including in intervention studies in order to demonstrate effectiveness. So finally, I think I just want to say a bit about the tensions between the education and the medical perspectives that really came out. These concerns about stigmatization. I got really worried about this because I'm sitting here saying, you know, we should talk about developmental language disorder, and somebody says, you're stigmatizing this poor child. You're raising, you know, you're making people think that they're definitely going to fail. But when I think about it, I think I've run longitudinal studies, other people I know have run them, and we know that there are children who are likely to have long-term problems, even with good intervention. And you're not helping those children to sort of pretend there isn't a long-term problem or to blame it all on the teachers or something like that. These problems exist. And so I think we really need to take active steps to educate teachers to recognise that some problems are serious and persistent, but they can still be helped. But they're not just always the fault of the parents or always the fault of bad teaching. And I think if one takes that point of view, you can work with teachers to counteract the more negative stereotypes that people are worried about, ensuring that all children have an education plan that will include a focus not just on what they can't do, but on what they can do and what they can shine at and be good at, and give some time to be allocated to that as well. So, in conclusion, we're going for developmental language disorder. It's far from perfect as a term, but there is no perfect term, we decided, I think at the end of the day, that was the conclusion, but we do need a label we can agree on. And this was one that people were, in the end, willing to agree on after much debate, but it's not a single homogeneous condition, and it's not perfect, but we hope that we can agree to go with that consensus, and if we do, we will raise the awareness and improve services and be better able at doing the much needed research. Thank you.